Today, we are talking about Labour hammering landlords with stricter EPC rules. This is something that we've seen a long time coming. In fact, we knew that the Conservatives had plans and kind of took that away. But we always knew that it was going to come back. Whether it was Conservative or whether it was a Labour government, this was something that landlords felt they had dodged the bullet, at least for a few years. And today we're going to break that down as to EPCs, the new rules, or at least the proposals from Labour in recent days, and how that's going to impact landlords, or how it's already impacting the rental market itself, because we have a lag whereby landlords are already anticipating this and were already making adjustments. Let's find out what those adjustments are. So this article came out, probably 3-4 days ago, and the government has gone out to formal consultation about stricter EPC performance certificates. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with EPCs, whether you're a landlord or otherwise, it is energy performance certificate. This is how you can measure how efficient your property is when it comes to heating, electricity, and so forth. Typically right now, you would have to do that every 10 years and need only to be renewed after that time, unless a rental property changes tenant. However, the government suggests that shorter durations could capture improvements or degradations in energy efficiency between times. We're going to break down the proposals as to what this will mean, whether you have a HMO, whether you have an existing tenant, or a tenant that's changing. We have EPCs required for every new tenancy. So landlords will need to obtain a new EPC each time they rent to a new tenant, replacing the current 10-year-old validity period. This change aims to reflect recent upgrades or improvements in the property energy efficiency. When it comes to HMOs, guys, a new EPC would be required for the entire HMO every time a single room is rented out. This closes a loophole in existing regulations where EPCs are only mandated when an entire property is rented. Transitions periods for HMO landlords. So landlords of HMOs will have a 24-month transitional period to comply with these requirements. So there is some relief there. Continuous EPC validity during tenancy. The government proposes ensuring that tenants in long-term agreements have access to valid and up-to-date EPC throughout their tenancy, not just when the property is marked. Half of landlords quitting or considering leaving the rental sector. So the barrage of criticism, legislation, and tax burdens aimed at landlords has resulted in almost half either actively leaving the rental sector or considering to do so. Now, a new survey by a prop tech supplier, Goodlord, suggests that 30% of landlords have either sold one of their rental properties or put one in the market in the past year. A further 17% of landlords say they're considering reducing their portfolio. When asked what's been driving the desire, this is back in October, to leave the market, reduce the size of the portfolio, 56% are planning to downsize or exit the market, said incoming legislation such as the Renters' Right Bill, in particular the abolition of Section 21, which of course we know is the so-called no-fault eviction, was a primary reason. Letting agents agree with this. 66% of them say that they believe that the new bill will ultimately lead to fewer rental properties. Over half of landlords, that's 52%, also said new rules around energy efficiency standards would be the reason for leaving the sector. And this was back in October. Now, today, in the last few days at least, we have new information of that EPC and what that looks like. I'm sure you'll agree that this 52% has now increased, at least for those landlords who have those old properties and know that that's going to cost them. Over the next 12 months, 41% of landlords say they plan to sell at least some rental properties. This is a comparison to 19% of landlords who actually decided to sell the property in the previous 12 months. But 41% decided to actually they will sell some of their rental properties. Now, there is a clue here, guys, some of their rental properties. So it's not that 40% of landlords are exiting the market. It's 40% of landlords are decided to sell some of their properties. And this could be professional landlords restructuring, readjusting, just making sure that they're getting rid of those properties that are simply not giving them the return, or perhaps not in the structure that is going to be the most viable for them. And casual landlords being those landlords who have a couple of properties leaving the market because it just simply doesn't make sense to them. All the scaremongering from the media is just far too much for them, or they just simply don't want to be a landlord anymore because it doesn't make sense for them. They don't have the time And yet at the same time, with regards to them actually being a landlord in the first place, it wasn't something they actually decided to do. They even inherited the property. A lot of people who accidentally became a landlord from a divorce, stayed with the property, moved elsewhere, and so forth. If you're not familiar with the type of work that perhaps you would need to be doing or potentially doing with these type of regulations, these are going to include, but not exclusively, you have insulation improvements. So this could be installing or upgrading insulation to the recommended 270 millimeters, adding cavity wall insulation or solid wall insulation where possible. And of course, this is going to be mostly for those period builders, because on new builds, I don't see how you're going to make that happen. Upgrading heating systems, so replacing old boilers with energy efficiency condensing boilers, improving windows and doors. I think from my perspective, at least, energy efficiency lighting, I think this is probably the most economical sort of change that you can do to the property. Adding renewable energy systems, sealing drought proofing, upgrading hot water systems, improving floor insulations, installing ventilation systems, and replacing inefficient appliances, which of course we know can be quite expensive. And here is another one. Many landlords to hike rents to pay for EPC improvements. So this isn't something that just impact landlords, guys. So those landlords who are decided to stay and saying, you know what, I'm not going to be bullied and I'm not going to be pushed out the market because of this EPC. I'll make it work. But then how did they make it work? Well, here you are. Here's an answer. And again, it's cause and effect, whether it's the Labour government or whether it's the Conservative sort of interfering with market dynamics, there's always going to be an impact, cause and effect. A mortgage lender survey reveals that over 2/3 of private landlords currently own at least one property that does not meet the new EPC target. Foundation Home Loans research found that awareness of these EPC standards is high, with 92% of landlords having at least some awareness of the requirements, but only 67% reporting a thorough understanding. Portfolio landlords with 4 or more buy-to-let mortgages demonstrate slightly lower knowledge, with 62% stating they fully understand the requirements. So some 42% of landlords intend to make the necessary improvements to bring their impacted properties up to stand. Again, a lot of landlords being quite resilient, quite resourceful, and saying, we'll make this work. Meanwhile, 24% plan to carry out works at the minimum costs required to comply and continue to let their property out. And another 14% aim to carry out the works that maximize the long-term value of property and continue to let out. Some 3%, this is 3%, will carry out works to bring their property up to standard, then sell it. However, 34% plan to sell without undertaking any work or not let the property. 17% respondents other, and 3% don't plan to carry out any works but continue letting out the property. So I'll be very worried about this 3%. I feel that this 3% is kind of burying your head in the sand and hoping for the best. I don't want to know about it. I'm not going to carry out any works. I'm going to continue letting the property and hope for the best. When suddenly what they get is having to do it, you know, it happens slowly and then suddenly. And then once they find out how much the cost is going to be, be it 15, 20 grand, they don't have that money. And that's where you start seeing landlords putting themselves in quite a pickle. For those who plan to carry out the necessary work, 17% expect to use their savings, 41% via rent increases, and 28% through grants. Now, I'm going to say something. If a landlord isn't putting money aside every year, every month for these type of things, slowly but surely, then I agree you shouldn't be a landlord, because you're not treating this as a business. You're not treating this as a business, then, you know, the type of landlord that are going to find yourself in trouble. A further 12% saying they would release equity from their portfolio, and 5% seeking a further advance from a mortgage lender, or 5% from a loan. But I hope this has been helpful in giving you a little bit more perspective with the EPC regulations. And if you have any further questions, do let me know if you're watching this on recorded.